I wanted to do a video about a concept which I've been calling the illusion of improvement. This idea is about a kind of a philosophical question, which is, can it be possible for every single individual in a society to be getting richer over time, and yet for society as a whole and for families as a whole to be getting poorer over time? And this is an important concept, I think, because in my opinion, definitely people in this country, the UK and many Western countries, have been getting continually poorer for at least the last 20 years or so. And yet if you look at most individuals, you will find that over time, they do tend to get richer over time. And that is because in most careers, you get salary rises as you get older, and many people are able to accumulate a little bit of cash and buy property, which makes them richer over time. So how is it possible that these two things simultaneously are happening? That individuals are getting richer and yet society as a whole is getting poorer. So I think the best way to explain what's happening here is through a graph. Now, we don't do many graphs or diagrams on this channel, but I think this diagram here explains really nicely what is happening. So on this graph, you've got time on the x-axis and you've got living standards on the y-axis. So, and what you have is 4 separate generations over time. And if you look at these 4 generations, you can see each generation over time is getting richer, but their children are also getting richer over time, but from a lower starting point and reaching a lower end point. So each generation over time is getting poorer, but each individual person is getting richer. And I think this describes really well what is happening now. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because another thing which I've been talking about a lot on the channel is we have seen in the last 15, 20, well, to be honest, 30 or 40 years, a very aggressive increase in house prices and other asset prices. And I suspect we will see very aggressive house prices in the next few years. Now, what is interesting about this is this economic action, the increase of house prices, it really bankrupts families over time because each generation finds it harder and harder to buy a house. They have to pay more rent, they have to pay more interest because they need bigger mortgages. But if you look at individual people, they will normally tell you when house prices rise, it's good for me. So we have an action which is impoverishing families, and yet most individuals within those families think this is good for me. So I think it's really important for people to understand this diagram essentially. What is important to understand is if you want to understand how your family is doing, how your community is doing, how your society is doing financially, it's not enough to look at just yourself and your path over time, or even you and your kids and your path over time. What you need to do is compare your kids to you at their age and your grandkids at their age. So if we go back to the graph, if you look at the living standards for young people, so I'll put 4 X's on the graph here, which marks each generation when they were young. And you can see that each generation when they were young is getting poorer over time. If we do the same thing for middle age, again, middle-aged people are getting poorer over time. The elderly, again, getting poorer over time. Despite the fact that each individual generation is getting richer over time, it's very important that you do this if you want to understand the future of your family and your communities. You need to compare generations when they were the same age. So I think once we understand this, we can start to sort of get rid of the division which is increasingly happening between elderly and the young when it comes to voting. I think elderly people see that their lives are getting better over time. They assume their kids' lives will get better over time, and they fail to realize that despite things like increasing house prices, which benefit them but hurt their kids, the long-term trajectory for their family, for their kids, for their community is increased poverty over time. Now that raises an interesting question, which is, well, if all families, or the vast majority of families, are getting poorer over time, but society as a whole is not getting poorer, GDP is not decreasing, then where is all of that missing wealth going? And to explain that, we're going to add one other line on this graph here, which is living standards of the rich over time. So as ordinary families are getting poorer, they're losing their wealth. The rich are getting richer at the fastest rate ever in history, and their living standards are dramatically increasing. So what we have here is quite an interesting situation, which is from a class perspective, ordinary families are basically being impoverished by the very rich. But the rich are able to convince ordinary families that they're getting better by creating this illusion of improvement, which is every single generation year by year, feels like they're getting richer, and every family, generation by generation, is being made poorer. So that's it basically. This is the illusion of improvement. It's really important to understand this because in the next 10, 20 years, house prices are going to go through the roof, and especially a lot of older generations who maybe own property are going to feel that they're winning, and they're often going to fail to realize that the consequence is their kids and their grandkids are being made poorer. If we can get enough people to recognize this, then we can get together and we can say we don't accept this. We don't accept a situation where wealth flows from ordinary families to the very rich, where living standards continually decrease over time. If we don't realize this, then it will happen and we will fall into a situation where the vast majority of families fall into poverty over time. We can reverse it. The only way to do that is by making rich people pay their fair share instead of taxing everybody who's working hard for their money. We're going to keep pushing for it. We hope you support us. Watch this video again, share it with your friends, share it with your family, send it to your mum, send it to your nan. Let's fight back. Let's not accept poverty for ordinary people. Thank you.